The Muslim invasion of Spain of 711 AD. Islam started among relatively small tribes in the desert towns of the Arabian Peninsula. But just a few generations after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, they almost miraculously conquered a huge chunk of the known world, including the Persian Empire and Christian Syria and Egypt. In fact, by the 11th century, around 2/3 of Christian lands were taken, and most of it permanently. Already in 711, only 80 years after the death of the Prophet, the Muslims invaded Spain under the leadership of General Tariq, and they remained in Spain until they were finally defeated in 1492, nearly 800 years later. Once in Spain, the Muslims quickly slew the Christian Visigoth king Roderick in battle. The Visigoths were a formerly barbarian tribe who had taken over Roman rule of Spain in the 5th century, but they were since fully Romanized. The Spanish Jews were treated horribly by the Visigoths, and as a result they understandably took the side of the invaders. The Muslims temporarily put the Jews in charge of various conquered cities, allowing the Muslims to continue their advance. Spanish cities were generally given the choice between conversion or surrender, and if these two options were rejected, war was declared. Jews and Christians who surrendered could continue to practice their religion as dhimmi or protected people, which did require them to pay an extra tax, known as the jizya, and public display of their religious symbols, including the cross, was prohibited. However, Muslim presence in Spain wasn't all bad for the West, as many contemporary Westerners agreed with. For the Muslims eventually founded the Caliphate of Córdoba, centered around the Spanish city Córdoba, which produced a golden age of architecture and scientific and philosophical learning. But the Islamic Golden Age will be a topic for a later lecture in this series. For now, my goal is to give a dispassionate account of the invasion of Spain, based on both Muslim and Christian manuscripts from the time. So, we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence and enlightenment. You'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface level understanding you get on other channels. So go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Let's start with a quick overview of the Muslim conquests. The Arabian Peninsula was unified under the Prophet Muhammad in the first half of the 7th century. His first successors, or caliphs, had all been close to Muhammad. The first was his old friend Abu Bakr. Then came his companions Umar and Uthman. And finally his adopted son Ali. And together these four men formed the Rashidun, or the rightly guided caliphate. Driven by the doctrine of jihad or holy war, the Rashidun Caliphate set out to spread Islamic rule. During their reign, the Muslims conquered the Persian Empire and also Egypt and Syria, which were at the time part of the Christian Eastern Roman Empire, today known as the Byzantine Empire. According to the Muslim historian Baladuri of the 9th century, one of the earliest Muslim sources, the Byzantines thought that the Arabs had come out of the desert because they were hungry, and they also hoped that they might return to the desert after some plundering. But Khalid, the so-called Sword of Allah, ensured that this was not the case. We read in this Muslim source, "It is neither hunger nor poverty that has driven us from our land. We, the Arabs, are drinkers of blood, and we know that there is no blood more tasty than that of the Greeks. And that is why we have come, to spill and to drink your blood." and similar quotes can be found in at least 2 other early Muslim sources. Their most decisive victory came at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, which was one of the most decisive military victories in history, and it ended Roman rule in Syria after 7 centuries. It is said that the Muslims took no prisoners, leading to thousands of deaths on Christian side. After hearing the news of the first victories against the Christians, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, preached, "Why are the troops of the Saracens, that is the Muslims, attacking us? Why has there been so much destruction and plunder? Why are there incessant outpourings of human blood? Why are the birds of the sky devouring human bodies? Why have churches been pulled down? Why is the cross mocked? Why is Christ blasphemed by pagan mouths? The vengeful and God-hating Saracens plunder cities, set on fire the holy churches, overturn the sacred monasteries, oppose the Byzantine armies arrayed against them, and in fighting raise up trophies of war and add victory to victory." Only a few weeks later, the Muslims besieged Jerusalem, which was given up by the Christians without a fight. In an act of benevolence, Umar did see to it that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest church in Christendom, which was built by Emperor Constantine and which was located on the supposed place of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, stayed operational and in Christian hands. We read that Umar also purposely avoided praying inside his newly conquered church and instead went outside for worship, for quote, "Otherwise the Muslims would want to seize this church as a mosque." Muhammad had hoped that the Muslims would not fight amongst themselves, but even the election of the first caliph had been controversial. Some Muslims preferred Abu Bakr, while others wanted Ali on the throne. And this immediately caused a split in the Muslim community between the Sunni and the Shia branch, and this split persists to this day. When Ali was finally made the 4th caliph, the disagreement quickly led to the first fitna, or the first Islamic civil war. And then in 661, Muawiyah, who had been one of Muhammad's scribes, came out on top and became the first caliph of the Umayyad Caliphate. Muawiyah also moved the capital of his new caliphate from Medina to the more cosmopolitan Damascus in Syria. And there the Muslims bought the Basilica of St. John the Baptist, demolished it and then built a mosque in its place, partly using the building materials of the church. Under Umayyad rule, the Muslims also conquered western India, the nomadic Berbers of northwest Africa, an area known as the Maghreb, and eventually they even took most of Spain. The Berbers, named after the Greek word barbarian, comprised of simple nomadic tribes. Yet they were tough fighters, and as a result the conquest of the Maghreb was hard. But the Arabs finally succeeded, and the Berbers converted to Islam. Under the later Abbasids, the Muslims would also enter southern Italy, where they managed to take over a few cities for a couple of decades. And in 846, the Muslims even sacked St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, but they were unable to breach Rome's city walls. And the Muslims also took Sicily between 831 and 1091. Now let's describe Spain before the invasion, when it was governed by the Visigoths. Spain at the time was also governed by barbarians, the so-called Visigoths or the Western Goths. The Goths originally lived beyond the northern border of the Roman Empire, but they were then threatened by the Huns and were permitted to enter the Roman Empire as refugees in 376. Alaric I, the first king of the Visigoths, famously sacked Rome as well in 410, although he died a year later. In 418, the Visigoths settled in southern Gaul in southern France, where they established an independent kingdom independent from the Roman Empire, with at its capital Toulouse. And later in the 5th century they invaded Spain during the rule of King Uruk. Although technically barbarians, by the time of the Muslim invasion the Visigoths were thoroughly Romanized. For instance, they adopted a law system based on Roman law, the best law system in the world. And interestingly, their law system also explicitly limited the power of the king, centuries before this was done by the Magna Carta in Britain. We read, "The royal power, as well as the entire body of the people, should be subject to the majesty of the law," and also how the avarice or the greed of the king should be restrained. The Visigoths also spoke Latin, maintained a Roman-like administration, issued coinage, preserved and built paved streets, public buildings, aqueducts, basilica, and also private and commercial baths. And they also founded various cities, most notably Racopolis, and these were the only newly founded cities in Western Europe between the 5th and the 8th century, a period known as the early Middle Ages. Some Visigoth monks also studied classical literature and poetry. The poet and theologian Theodulf, for instance, studied Ovid and Virgil, and after the Muslim invasion he fled to France, where he became one of the pillars of the Carolingian Renaissance, the push for more education by King Charlemagne. The Visigoth period also produced a world-class scholar, namely Bishop Saint Isidore of Seville, who wrote about linguistics, science, cosmology, history, and many other topics. In fact, he became the most widely cited author of the High Middle Ages. We also know that the Muslims were impressed by Visigoth architecture. For instance, they spoke of the splendor of the Visigoth court in Toledo, which no longer exists. And one Muslim chronicler described the architecture at Cordoba as, quote, "the wonderful remains of the Greeks, Romans, and the Goths." The Muslims would also adopt a number of key features of Visigoth architecture. The famous horseshoe arch, which we now associate with Muslim architecture, were actually adopted from the Visigoths, who in turn got it from the Romans. And Islamic bath culture also had precedence in Roman and Visigothic Spain. But despite all these laudable characteristics of the Visigoths, we shouldn't take it too far. Although they weren't barbarians, they also definitely didn't produce a golden age of learning or architecture. Important for our story, the Visigoths were also terrible anti-Semites, following Byzantine example. The Jews were not allowed to hold public office, had to pay additional taxes, and were eventually forced to choose between baptism and slavery. Although this wasn't always successfully enforced, since there was still a Jewish population when the Muslims arrived. The anti-Semitism of the Visigoths turned out to be a big mistake, as it got the Jews to side with the Muslims during the invasion. Now we turn to the invasion of Spain. Since we're dealing with the early 8th century, historical accounts of the invasion are sparse. In fact, we only have 3 contemporary or near-contemporary sources. The most important one is the Chronicle of 754, which was written by a Christian but under Muslim rule in Spain. This text presents a short history of the conquests of Islam, from the first caliphs up until the conquest of Spain and also the raids on France. And the writer seems to be well informed and reasonably objective. There are also various Muslim accounts of the invasion, but they are from later centuries. And of course, as always, neither side is perfectly objective. But in many cases the sources agree, and in these cases the information is deemed more reliable. Secondly, there's also an important administrative document from the Muslim side, namely a treaty made between the Muslims and a Visigoth lord named Theodemir, and it is dated very early to 713 AD, only 2 years after the invasion, and we'll discuss this treaty later on. And finally, there is some archaeological evidence. There is some evidence of violent destruction in some cities, dated to between 711 and 713, and archaeologists have found votive crowns near Toledo that were buried there by Christians for safekeeping, a practice that is actually confirmed by a Muslim source, which we'll discuss in a later lecture. Now let's look at the main narrative. In the early 8th century, the Arabs raided Spain a number of times on the order of General Musa. A man named General Tariq, who was put in charge of one of these raiding parties, came back, according to a Muslim source, with, quote, such numbers of prisoners, which neither Musa nor his men had ever seen, and also vast booty. Tariq also told Musa stories of the riches of Spain, which was, quote, filled with treasures of all kinds, whose inhabitants would make very handsome slaves, a country abounding in springs, gardens, rivers, and a land yielding every description of fruit and plants. We continue. He found likewise 25 royal diadems, beautifully ornamented with jewels, books treating of the manner of using plants, minerals, and animals advantageously for men, the work of ancient philosophers. All these precious objects, together with an immense quantity of rubies and other colored gems, stored in golden and silver urns of beautiful workmanship, and ornamented with large pearls, were the fruits of Tariq's conquest. And enticed by this, Musa decided to organize a full-blown invasion. In 711, the Muslims, now with Berber soldiers on their side, invaded Spain, led once more by General Tariq. Tariq entered Spain on a place that came to be known as the Rock of Tariq, or Jebel Tariq, which was later westernized to Gibraltar. And not long after, General Musa followed with another army. The Visigoths elites, who had once beaten back Attila the Hun himself, had since become complacent, enjoying their lives in their large estates. And the elites also lived too far apart, which meant that they couldn't assemble quickly, and as a result they were quickly ran over. Their king, King Roderick, was slain on the battlefield at the Battle of Guadalete. Cities that resisted could expect a massacre. In a Christian account we read Musa burned any city that resisted, quote, crucified the nobility and the older men, and cut to pieces the young men and the infants. Toledo, the Visigoth capital, did not resist, but according to the Chronicle of 754, Musa still executed some Visigoth nobles, and the Archbishop of Toledo fled the city. And indeed we find the Archbishop's name among attenders of a church council in Rome, confirming at least this part of the story. In Cordoba, some Christian warriors fought back and eventually retreated to a church, and according to one Arabic source, the church was then burned to the ground, burning the warriors inside. Cordoba was then placed in the hands of the Jews, while the Muslims continued their advance, and this pattern was repeated in many other places, including Toledo and Seville. Following the precedent of earlier Muslim conquests, Visigoth cities and towns were often given three options that were dictated by Islam. They could either convert to Islam or surrender and pay an extra tax, and if they refused these two options, war would be declared upon them. Most opted for the second option, paying that extra tax called the jizya. And according to the Quran, the point of this tax was to, quote, humble Jews and Christians. And this interpretation was later confirmed by the important commentators of the Quran. The Jews and the Christians who surrendered were allowed to practice their religion, yet only in private. And this included that they were not allowed visible religious symbols, both on the body and also no crosses on churches, and no church bells as well. Paying the jizya did buy Jews and Christians protection. As a result, they were called dhimmi, meaning protected people, for they were recognized as fellow, quote, peoples of the book, because they shared a monotheistic faith. And, as we shall see in a later lecture, Jews and Christians were allowed to thrive economically, and even climb quite far up the social ladder, as long as they stuck to these rules. And this both had precedent in the life of the Prophet, but the Muslims also just needed Jewish and Christian expertise. In the words of the Muslim historian Ibn Khaldun, because, quote, the Arabs at the time were still coarse, without education, and not very skilled in the arts of writing and mathematics. Thus they used the Jews, Christians, and freed foreigners to handle their administrative affairs, the Arabs barely coming out of their nomadic existence. Because the Muslims were in the minority in Spain, they also negotiated treaties with local lords, allowing them to stay semi-independent. We still have a copy of a treaty with the Visigoth lord Theodemir, which is dated to 713 AD, in which it is stated that he was allowed to keep his position in return for submission and the jizya. We read, "In the name of Allah, the Merciful and Compassionate, this is a document granted by Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa, which is the son of General Musa, to Theodemir or Tutmir in Arabic, establishing a treaty of peace and the promise and protection of Allah and His Prophet. May God bless him and grant him peace. We will not set special conditions for him, or for any among his men, nor harass him, nor remove him from power. His followers will not be killed or taken prisoner, nor will they be separated from their women and children. They will not be coerced in matters of religion. Their churches will not be burned, nor will sacred objects be taken from their realm, so long as he, that is Tutmir, remains sincere and fulfills the following conditions that we have set for him. He will not give shelter to fugitives, nor to our enemies, nor encourage any protected person to fear us, nor conceal news of our enemies. He and each of his men shall also pay 1 dinar every year, together with 4 measures of wheat, 4 measures of barley, 4 liquid measures of concentrated fruit juice, 4 liquid measures of vinegar, 4 of honey, and 4 of olive oil." Not long after his arrival, General Musa was recalled to Damascus, the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, and he took with him many captives and booty. According to the Muslim scholar Al-Qurtubi, we read, "All the spoils consisted of 30 skins full of gold and silver coins, pearls, rubies, topazes, and emeralds, costly robes, 1,100 prisoners, men, women, and children, of whom 400 were princes of royal blood." And this is confirmed in the Chronicles of 754, which states, "Musa brought with him from Spain some noblemen who had escaped the sword, and also gold and silver, a large quantity of valuable ornaments, precious stones and pearls, ointments to kindle women's desire, and many other things from all over Spain that would be tedious to record." And back home, according to the Chronicle, Musa showed Caliph Walid, quote, "the resources of Spain, its riches, and the beauty of its young girls." According to the Chronicles, the Muslims controlled most of Spain within 10 years, including Septimania in southern France. The estates of the Spanish monarchy came in Muslim hands and were distributed among the Arab elites. The Berber majority, who had risked their lives for the Arab cause, got little. They were often considered second-class citizens. Tired of this, the Berbers eventually rebelled in 739, both in the Maghreb, that is northwestern Africa, and in Spain. The Umayyad Caliphate managed to retain Spain, but lost the western Maghreb. And thus unfolded the early stages of the Muslim occupation of Spain. In the next lecture, I'll discuss the Muslim raids from Spain into France, which got the Muslims close to Paris until they were finally beaten back. In the next lecture, we'll discuss the Caliphate of Cordoba, which produced a golden age of architecture and scientific and philosophical learning, which in fact helped pull barbarian Western Europe out of the Middle Ages. So stay tuned. But for now, if you want to know more about Muslim history or any other topic from world history, read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye.